A good and Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. Shabbos is almost here. Thank God we're so excited for Shabbos. It's been pouring rain here in Los Angeles. How is it by you? I'm a little verklempt. Again, this Facebook glitch, it's making me hard to see anything but the last 4 comments. I keep refreshing and trying to get, I don't know. My candle is small. In my defense, we started a new candle last Friday, so it's an 8-day shrinking candle. At any rate, let's muddle through and light up the darkness. Okay, I can't welcome everybody except the last 4 comments. That's all I'm seeing. But Kathleen says hello from Bakersfield, and Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey, and Jane from Georgia, and Tom says Shabbat Shalom. It's great to have you with us, my holy sisters and brothers. Over there on the YouTube side, I see Neil in Virginia, and Samantha saying Shabbat Shalom to everybody from Tacoma. Paula says she's in Chicago, bracing for a weekend snowstorm. Margaret says it's freezing. Sharon says it's freezing. They just keep disappearing on me. Paul was saying, I'm an old LA guy, born in Santa Monica. Bill says shalom. All right, we're going to do the best that we can. Today's class is dedicated by Rena Klein in memory of Joseph and Miriam Kaplan. May Joseph and Miriam Kaplan's memory always be for a blessing. May our learning today resound to their credit in the world of souls and lift their souls, their neshamas, ever higher. And we say amen. And Rena, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you for supporting our nonprofit. If you're interested in sponsoring a day of AT daily to honor somebody or somebody's memory, or for the healing, or to mark an important event in your life or the life of a loved one or the passing of a loved one, go to our website, accidentaltalmudist.org. You can just follow the links to donate, or just go to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, and that will get you there. Okay. We've got another reason I'm a little verklempt today. Verklempt, it's a Yiddish word, means, scattered, muddled, can't quite get it together. We've got a challenging daf today. It's a challenging daf. We're finally going to finish our discussion of the first Mishna here in chapter 6. Where are we? We're on page 69. That's daf Samech Tes. Here in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We're in the second part of Tractate Pesachim, when we're generally discussing the laws of the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, the Passover offering that was brought, a sacrifice made in Jerusalem when the temple was standing. We have not been able to bring this offering since the temple was destroyed about 2,000 years ago. The general teaching of this Mishnah here, the first Mishnah of chapter 6, is that what do we do when Passover comes Saturday night? So we have to slaughter the Passover offering, whether it's a lamb or a young goat, on the afternoon before Passover starts. So if Passover falls on a Saturday night, that afternoon is Shabbos, and normally we would not slaughter an animal on Shabbos because it's Passover, because the Torah commands that we slaughter the Passover offering in the afternoon before Passover starts, and that we do so at its appointed time. That slaughter, which normally would be prohibited on Shabbos, overrides the Torah restriction, the Torah prohibition of slaughtering on Shabbos. It overrides Shabbos. So now the question that's being asked and is going to be debated by Eliezer and Akiva, rabbis Eliezer and Akiva, is, well, now that because we're overriding Shabbos with respect to a Torah prohibition that we don't normally slaughter an animal on Shabbos, and that's prohibited by Torah law, since we're setting aside this Torah law, do we also set aside rabbinic decrees, actions that are prohibited on Shabbos, not because they're specified in the Torah as being prohibited, but rather that they were rabbinically decreed to be prohibited, usually to protect us from coming to violate an actual biblical prohibition. So now that we've set aside the biblical law against slaughter on Shabbos because of Passover, do we also set aside related rabbinic decrees for the sake of performing this mitzvah of bringing the Passover offering? Generally speaking, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say, yes, we've set aside the rabbinic decrees. Now that we've set aside the Torah law, we also set aside the rabbinic decree. Rabbi Akiva, Eliezer's student, is going to argue with his teacher and say, no, we don't set aside these rabbinic decrees. We only violate that which is absolutely necessary in order to bring the Korban Pesach, to bring the Passover offering. But any other rabbinic decree, even if it's to do something associated with bringing the Passover offering, but if it's not essential to bringing that offering, we don't set aside that decree. So what we're going to do today is first I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. We've mentioned their names many times, but there's a nice note here on this page in the Koran Talmud about their personalities, a little bit of background on them. And then we're going to talk a little bit of background on this particular dispute. And then we're going to go through most of the A side of page 69. We're just going to actually, often I just take concepts and sort of, share with you the key concepts of a page. Here we're actually going to follow the argument between Akiva and Eliezer. And I must say, it's confusing. It's not an easy argument to follow because right near the beginning of it, they're going to say, well, actually, we should reverse the order of how this argument was reported to us. The later sages are saying they received the argument the dispute between Eliezer and Akiva in a little bit of a confused manner. And so they kind of reordered the points of the argument. That's going to make it harder for us to follow this argument, which is not easy in itself. But let's see if we can do it. Let's see if we can unpack this argument and really follow what is between them. What exactly are they arguing about? And where does the law eventually come out in this dispute between two great sages? I mean, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is really one of the great sages of the Talmud. And Akiva, who started as Eliezer's student, ends up being, perhaps the greatest of the sages. Perhaps, you can argue, but he is compared to Moses, and some of the innovations that Akiva brought into the Jewish Torah tradition are considered to be almost on a level with Moses, who wrote the Torah as God dictated. All right, so let's see the background and then the argument. So, who is Rabbi Eliezer? Whenever the name Rabbi Eliezer occurs in the Talmud without a patronymic, when it doesn't say Rabbi Eliezer ben someone, it refers to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the son of Hyrcanus, also known as Rabbi Eliezer the Great, one of the leading sages in the period after the destruction of the Second Temple. Rabbi Eliezer was born to a wealthy family of Levites who traced their lineage back to Moses. Rabbi Eliezer began studying Torah late in life, but quickly became an outstanding disciple of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Indeed, Rabban Yochanan remarked, if all the sages of Israel were on one side of a scale and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was on the other, he would outweigh them all. Rabbi Eliezer was blessed with a remarkable memory. All his life, he attempted in his Torah study and in his halachic rulings to follow the traditions of his rabbis without additions. He was somebody who had mastered the entire oral tradition perfectly. With that huge memory and that huge intelligence of his, he understood the entire tradition as it existed at the time that he sort of entered the stream of the oral tradition, and he was a master of everything that came before. And he sought to transmit that tradition, applying the laws of that tradition to new situations that might come up, but without adding new laws, right? It's not that he was against innovation, it's that he was against changing the law just to suit the time, as it were. He said the law can work, the law is complete, the law is the law. When we have new situations, we have to figure out what in the existing law will help us resolve that situation. Nevertheless, despite being the primary student of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the one who sort of rescued rabbinic Judaism as the temple was destroyed. He's the one who asked the Roman general destroying Jerusalem and the temple, at least let me go and have Yavne and its sages, that we can keep the Torah tradition going even if the temple is being destroyed. And he prevailed in seeking that. So Yochanan ben Zakkai was very much in the stream of Beis Hillel, right? The followers of Hillel. Nevertheless, Rabbi Eliezer, who was Yochanan ben Zakkai's student, tended toward the views of Beis Shammai, right? So Beis Shammai were this way. They were more strict. They were less easygoing. They were more like the law is the law, and even if it produces a difficult situation, we apply the law. So that's more in the Beis Shammai stream. Rabbi Eliezer tended toward the views of Beis Shammai. Rabbi Eliezer's close friend, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, entirely followed the views of Beis Hillel. And many fundamental halachic disputes between these sages, between Eliezer and Yehoshua, are recorded in the Mishna. Because of Rabbi Eliezer's staunch and unflinching adherence to tradition, he was unwilling to accede to the majority view. When the majority decided, okay, it's time to change the law for some reason, he said, no, we've received this tradition. It doesn't matter that it's the majority of you that want to change it. This is the way that we received it. And that's where Eliezer really got himself in trouble. He wouldn't go along to get along, and he ended up being ostracized by his fellow sages. His conduct generated so much tension among the sages that Rabban Gamliel, the brother of Eliezer's wife, Ima Shalom, meaning his brother-in-law, who was also the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, was forced to excommunicate Eliezer to prevent the proliferation of controversy among the sages. This ban was lifted only after Rabbi Eliezer's death. Virtually all of the sages of the next generation were Rabbi Eliezer's students. He was greatly loved, greatly admired, and it was this one dispute between him and the other sages that ended up being so difficult that it caused that rift between him and all of them. But everyone loved him and respected him and you know, took in his teachings. They were his students who became all the leading lights of the next generation. And it's not like his students were ostracized. It was really what ended up happening between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabban Gamliel, a story we often allude to. Well, again, not tell today, but we'll get to it. That story is called, if you want to look it up, The Oven of Achnai, Achnai. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer's son Hyrcanus was also a sage. So we're not talking about that big major dispute between Eliezer and Rabban Gamliel. Today we're just talking about a much smaller dispute, but a passionate one, between Eliezer and his student, the great Rabbi Akiva. Who was Akiva? Rabbi Akiva, who lived just after the destruction of the Second Temple, was one of the greatest of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishna. Unlettered, illiterate, literally illiterate, until the age of 40, Akiva was encouraged by his wife Rachel to devote himself to the study of Torah. After years of study under the tutelage of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Yehoshua ben Hananiah and others, he acquired thousands of students and established his own academy in Bnei Barak. So Rabbi Akiva started very late. Eliezer started somewhat late too, but Akiva very late. I mean, he was illiterate when he was 40 and ended up becoming such a great sage in the history of Israel. And as we'll see, because he started late, he was very humble about even asking a question. He was just learning. And he only much later revealed himself. I really can identify with that because, you know, I came back to Judaism late and I started learning late in life. And so when I'm around these much younger guys who learned in yeshiva all their lives, you know, I feel very like, what am I going to tell them? They know so much more than me. Their Hebrew's so much better than mine, etc. But at a certain point, you know, when you have something to say, you got to say it, right? So Rabbi Akiva systematized and arranged the many oral traditions, and it was the Mishna of Rabbi Akiva, as received by his student, Rabbi Meir, that ultimately became the basis for the 6 orders of the Mishnah, right? So basically, Rabbi Akiva is the one who kind of was able to take all the oral traditions that were around at that time and start to systematize them, and so that they could be understood and categorized in a way that would eventually lead Rabbi Meir to take what Rabbi Akiva had organized and say, okay, these are the Mishnahs, this is the order we should put them in. It was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi who is credited with authoring the Mishnah and allowing it to be written down. But what he wrote down was essentially what Akiva and his student Meir had organized. Rabbi Akiva was the spiritual leader of the Bar Kokhba revolt. He even proclaimed Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah early in the struggle, but he later retracted that opinion. So this was a terrible thing that happened. The temple was destroyed in either the year 69 or the year 70. The Bar Kokhba revolt was around the year 135. And that was a disastrous revolt against the Roman authority that was presiding over the Holy Land. This man Bar Kokhba led the revolt. Rabbi Akiva was much taken by him, thought he was a great leader, going to be good for Israel, could even be the Messiah. Eventually, he realized that this was a terrible idea, but it was too late. In that revolt, I don't know, I think something like 1 million Jews were killed. And that's really when the land of Israel became a wasteland, right? When you think of it, it was the land of milk and honey. It was such a rich, rich, wonderful land. And then, for so many thousands of years afterwards, for centuries afterward, it was just this desert wasteland. How did this rich, beautiful, fecund land become a wasteland? When the Romans put down that revolt, I'm pretty sure I learned this, that is when they salted the earth, right? That idea of salting the earth. They must not have... of salting the earth, and that's really what destroyed the Holy Land. So, Rabbi Akiva was certainly not immune from error, right? And he made a big mistake in backing this Bar Kokhba, and it was a terrible, terrible price that everyone paid. And eventually, Akiva himself would end up a martyr, killed by the Romans for daring to teach Torah. So despite Roman decrees against disseminating Torah, the aged Rabbi Akiva at the end of his life continued to teach. Rabbi Akiva was arrested by the Romans, imprisoned, tried, and sentenced to death. As one of the 10 martyrs, he suffered a martyr's death at the hands of the Romans. As the Romans were torturing him to death, he recited the Shema and explained to his students that he now has the opportunity to fulfill the true meaning of loving God with all one's soul. So can you imagine, as he was being, burnt at the stake by the Romans, he used that last moment of his life as a teaching to his students. That's somebody who was truly dedicated to Torah. I'm going to read one more thing in background about the particular dispute that we're going to discuss now between Eliezer between Eliezer and Akiva. So in this dispute, Eliezer is going to be a little bit offended by his student Akiva, and he's going to say that you have responded to me lightheartedly, meaning you mocked me, right? That you made a joke out of something that I was trying to tell you, and he was quite offended by that. This statement can be perhaps understood in light of what is found in the Jerusalem Talmud. Rabbi Akiva studied with Rabbi Eliezer for 13 years without Rabbi Eliezer recognizing his greatness. So you can imagine Akiva, who started so late in life, and literally when he first started, he had to learn to read. And so he had a very young son with whom he went to kindergarten. And he was not embarrassed, and he just learned how to read by accompanying his son to kindergarten. And he kept learning and kept learning and kept learning. Eventually, he went to the yeshiva, right, and started learning with the other people training to be Torah scholars, training to be sages. But everyone else in there was 20 years younger than him or more. And so he was just very quiet, right? And for 13 years, even though the great Rabbi Eliezer was Akiva's teacher, Eliezer never recognized that Akiva was the greatness of Akiva. I mean, obviously he was a genius. The kind of Torah light that he would eventually become makes it clear that Akiva at all times was a genius. He didn't become intelligent. His intelligence didn't become penetrating later. He was a genius. How could Eliezer not recognize that? Because Akiva must have been mum. I mean, he must have really kept his mouth shut. But after learning for 13 years, he had mastered everything that he had heard, and he finally started to speak up and reveal who he truly was. And this question, which forms a dispute that we're going to be talking about, is the first question that Akiva asked of his teacher Eliezer, the first time he challenged Eliezer, as it were. Rabbi Eliezer was surprised by the difficult question posed by a student that he had not appreciated up until this point. With regard to Rabbi Eliezer's condemnation of Rabbi Akiva, with the statement that we'll hear in the course of this argument, that his death will be by slaughter, meaning you're challenging me on the nature of slaughter, perhaps your death will be by slaughter, and that a similar statement appears elsewhere in the Talmud, where Eliezer says, I will be surprised if he dies naturally. And of course, Akiva ends up being martyred by the Romans. And the fact that Eliezer said that, when he felt like he'd been accosted by a junior, by a disciple, and he said, you're challenging me on slaughter, perhaps your death will be by slaughter, or if he said, I will be surprised if he dies a natural death. That interchange is often cited, and elsewhere it happens there's other examples of this, where somebody challenges a sage, not just, saying, well, but you said this and I say this, but where it seems that they're being disrespectful, right? So if it seems that they're being disrespectful to a sage, the sage, he might just give him a look. He might say something like this, but it gets manifest as a kind of a curse. And so even the unwitting, half-handed curse of a sage has consequences, right? It has consequences. And in the same way that our father Jacob, right? Jacob, the children of Israel are named after Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. When he said, and Lavan, his father-in-law, came chasing after him, and it's claiming that the reason he was chasing them is because Jacob and his 4 wives left in the middle of the night, and not only did they leave without saying goodbye, but they stole Lavan's idols, right? He had some kind of idols for idolatry. And Jacob said, nobody here took your idols. If anybody did take them, they can die. Right? And what he didn't know was that his favorite wife, his beloved Rachel, for some reason took one of these idols or some of these idols of her father, perhaps to stop her father from practicing idolatry or for some other reason that's unknown. But he said that about his wife, and then what happened? She died, giving birth to the last of the 12 sons, Benjamin. And it's like his curse. He obviously didn't intend to curse Rachel, but he did say whoever took that idol will die, and it ended up happening that she died a premature death. And so we'll see that in this argument. All right, so let's get into the argument. Again, the idea is, the question that they're arguing is, we set aside the prohibition against slaughtering animals on Shabbos when we need to slaughter the Passover offering on the afternoon before Passover begins. So if Passover begins Saturday night, we override the Shabbos restriction on slaughter to slaughter that Passover offering. Now that we have set aside a Torah law in order to fulfill the mitzvah, the obligation of slaughtering the Passover lamb on the afternoon before Passover, do we also set aside all rabbinic decrees which may be associated with this? And in the course of the discussion, we'll talk about what kinds of rabbinic decrees those would be. Like, namely, if a person is in a state of tuma, a person is tameh, he's ritually impure, and he needs to be sprinkled in order to become pure with the waters of sprinkling, the water of the red heifer. Like if he's impure because he touched a corpse, So are we going to sprinkle him so that he can complete his purification so that he can then bring the Korban Pesach? He can then, participate and bring the Passover offering. And sprinkling, which, what's the labor of sprinkling? Just sprinkling a little bit of water on somebody. I mean, you can wash your hands on Shabbat. Why can't you sprinkle some water? But the sages actually issued a rabbinic decree against sprinkling on Shabbos. Why? Because you might come to carry the waters of sprinkling through the public domain on Shabbos in order to sprinkle, and then you would have violated that law against carrying in the public domain. Okay, so here's the argument. It was taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer said, what reason do I have to say that yes, we set aside rabbinic decrees and we do anything that's necessary in order to bring anything associated with bringing the Passover offering, even if it violates Shabbos, even if it violates Shabbos rabbinic decrees. If actions, says Rabbi Eliezer, if actions that facilitate the performance of the mitzvah and are done after the slaughter, such as cleaning the intestines, which is permitted according to all opinions, right? When do you clean the intestines of the Passover offering? After you've slaughtered it, right? So you already violated Shabbos. Cleaning the intestine is not necessary to do on Shabbos. You could wait until Shabbos ends because you're not going to cook the Passover offering until Shabbos ends anyway. Why not wait till Shabbos ends to clean the intestines? But in fact, the rabbis said, all agree that you do clean the intestines, so you do it right away after the Paschal lamb is slaughtered. All agree that you clean the intestines, and if that overrides Shabbos, even though the mitzvah of slaughtering the lamb has already been done, is it possible to say that actions that facilitate the performance of the mitzvah and must be done before the slaughter do not also override Shabbos? Right? So since we're already saying that we're allowed to clean the intestines after the slaughter, so why not allow other rabbinic decrees to be violated that normally we don't do on Shabbos, allow them to be violated as well, since they facilitate slaughtering the Passover offering. Rabbi Akiva said to him, "What reason do I have to reject this comparison? If actions that facilitate the performance of the mitzvah that are done after the slaughter override Shabbos, it's because the slaughter has already overridden Shabbos." Right? Already we don't have a perfect Shabbos anymore. We overrode Shabbos in order to slaughter. Now that we've overridden Shabbos, already Shabbos, we did something we wouldn't normally do on Shabbos, so then we'll go one step further and clean the intestines as well. But can we say the same? But can you say that the actions that facilitate the performance of the mitzvah and are done before the slaughter should override Shabbos as well? That's different, according to Rabbi Akiva, because you haven't, at the time that you're going to do these other actions that are before the slaughter, in order to facilitate doing the slaughter of the mitzvah, slaughter of the lamb, you have slaughtering the lamb hasn't happened yet. So you haven't actually overridden the laws of Shabbos yet. So if you're going to now override these rabbinic decrees, it's a fresh breaking of Shabbos, right? Because the slaughter hasn't happened yet. And so since, so according to Rabbi Akiva, it's a different case, right? Once you've slaughtered a lamb on Shabbos, okay, so you broke Shabbos, now you can clean the intestines too. But before you slaughter the lamb, you haven't broken Shabbos. So why should we violate these other rabbinic decrees that aren't really necessary to make the mitzvah happen? They're related to it, but they're not essential to it. So according to Akiva, we're not going to do it. Alternatively, and this is where it gets problematic, alternatively, Rabbi Akiva brings another reason. Because perhaps the offering will be found to be disqualified. Right? So this could happen before or after you slaughter it. Right? So what Akiva seems to be saying is, let's say that you were going to violate the rabbinic decree on sprinkling a person so that you could render him tahor. Now he's in a state of purity, and now he's qualified to eat the Passover offering. So you're going to allow that to him so that he can then even slaughter it himself, right? Which he couldn't do if he was impure. But, says Akiva, maybe he's going to violate the rabbinic decree against sprinkling on Shabbos. Now he's in a state of purity. But the lamb that he was bringing turns out to be disqualified. They hadn't noticed it before. So he violated Shabbos in order to sprinkle and purify himself in order that he could slaughter the lamb. But now he can't slaughter the lamb. So it was essentially breaking Shabbos in vain because the reason he did it was to slaughter the lamb. And then it turns out that he can't slaughter the lamb. And it could even happen after you slaughter the lamb that it turns out that it was a treifa, right? That you can't eat it. It's not kosher. That's something you wouldn't know until you killed it. But then you would have slaughtered in vain because it turns out that animal was not fit to have its blood sprinkled on the altar or to be eaten as a Paschal lamb. Rabbi Eliezer rejects this argument. He says, if you are concerned about this possibility, it should also not be slaughtered, right? But if you're concerned that it's going to turn out that you shouldn't slaughter that, he's saying to Akiva, well, you said, well, maybe you sprinkled a person, for example, so that he could slaughter the lamb, and then it turns out that the lamb is unfit, so he's not even going to be able to slaughter it. If that's your argument, well, then we shouldn't slaughter the lamb at all, because after we slaughter it, we might learn that it was a treifa. It might turn out retroactively that lamb never should have been slaughtered. And the person will be found to have violated Shabbos retroactively. So that's good. Those are the points of the argument so far. This is where it gets a little confusing. Rather, and this seems to be a later sage, maybe in a more of the Talmudic period, now says, rather, the course of the discussion must have gone as follows. Rabbi Akiva said this last reason to Rabbi Eliezer at the beginning, and he refuted it as explained above. And then Rabbi Akiva said to him this other reason. What reason do I have to reject this comparison? Well, if actions that facilitate the performance of the mitzvah override, etc., right? And then Rabbi Akiva, and so it seems like maybe Rabbi Akiva is mocking Rabbi Eliezer and saying, well, you could take it very far and then we're not going to be able to slaughter it all. We learned in the Mishna that Rabbi Akiva responded and said to Rabbi Eliezer that the law governing the sprinkling of the purifying water of a red heifer, right, this is what we've been talking about, sprinkling a person who has become impure by touching a corpse, proves that actions prohibited by a rabbinic decree, even when they are performed for the sake of a mitzvah, do not override Shabbos. And he then goes on to argue that we can reverse the order of this argument and conclude by way of the Kal V'chomer inference that even slaughter does not override Shabbos, right? So then it's what we just said. It's like you can take it too far, and then it seems like he was mocking Eliezer. It was taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer said to him about this, Akiva, you have mockingly responded to me with a faulty Kal V'chomer inference with regard to slaughter. His death will be by slaughter, meaning as a punishment for this disrespect, you will be slaughtered by other people. Rabbi Akiva said to him, you're misunderstanding what I'm saying, right? I'm not mocking you, says Rabbi Akiva. He says, my teacher, do not deny my contention at the time that we are discussing this inference, for this is the tradition that I received from you. Right? He says, I'm not mocking you. I learned this from you, that sprinkling doesn't override Shabbos. And as we'll see, it's going to turn out that they were talking about two different kinds of sprinkling. I received this tradition from you. Sprinkling is prohibited by rabbinic decree and does not override Shabbos. Actually, it's not that it's two different kinds of sprinkling. It's sprinkling for a different purpose. One purpose is that you might think a person that is in a state of ritual impurity, he's tameh, he's going to be sprinkled so that he can participate in the Passover offering. A different reason that somebody might get sprinkled is because he's a Kohen, he's a priest, and he wants to eat teruma, which is also an obligation. It's a commandment that a priest eats teruma. but he can't eat it in a state of tumah, in a state of ritual impurity. So the sages said, we don't allow a priest to be sprinkled on Shabbos in order to eat teruma. And so then do we derive from that and also a person who wants to participate in the Paschal offering cannot be sprinkled for the same reason, or perhaps not? The Gemara asks, seeing that Rabbi Eliezer taught Rabbi Akiva this law, that sprinkling purifying water does not override Shabbos, well, what's the reason that he retracted this opinion? Why does Eliezer not hold by this now? Now Rabbi Eliezer seems to be saying that, yes, we do sprinkle in order to allow somebody to participate in the Passover offering, when earlier he taught Akiva that we do not allow sprinkling by rabbinic decree on Shabbos, right? On Shabbos, we don't sprinkle and we don't override that rabbinic decree. Ula explained, when Rabbi Eliezer taught Akiva this law, he taught it to him with respect to sprinkling that is performed in order to enable a ritually impure priest to partake of teruma, the first tithe that people set aside to give to a priest. That's consecrated food that only a priest can eat. This sprinkling does not override Shabbos because even separating teruma itself does not override Shabbos. So that's the difference between teruma and the Passover offering, right? Separating teruma to give it to a priest is also prohibited on Shabbos. So therefore, that he should sprinkle so that he can eat the teruma, when teruma itself, creating teruma by setting aside a portion of a farmer's crop, that's not going to be done on Shabbos. So why should he sprinkle himself to eat it on Shabbos? That's different than the Passover lamb, which we are commanded to override Shabbos for. And so you might think that therefore the sprinkling should also be set aside and we override it for Shabbos. This sprinkling does not override Shabbos because even separating teruma itself does not override Shabbos. But he never taught Rabbi Akiva this law with respect to sprinkling that is performed in order to enable someone to eat of the Paschal lamb. So that's consistent with Rabbi Eliezer's view that we set aside all these rabbinic decrees in order to enable someone to participate in the Passover offering, whereas Akiva is going to say, no, only that which is necessary to the offering is going to be allowed, not anything that is not essential to it. The Gemara notes that Rabbi Akiva as well, when he challenged Rabbi Eliezer, challenged him with regard to the law of sprinkling for teruma. And his objection should be understood as follows. Eating teruma is a mitzvah, and sprinkling the purifying water on someone who is ritually impure is only prohibited due to a rabbinic decree. And nevertheless, sprinkling purifying water on a ritually impure priest in order to enable him to eat teruma is prohibited on Shabbos. Thus it follows by a kal v'chomer inference that slaughter, which is a biblically prohibited labor, should certainly be forbidden on Shabbos, even when performed for the sake of a mitzvah. And Rabbi Eliezer thought Rabbi Akiva was challenging him with regard to the law of sprinkling that is performed in order to enable to eat the Paschal lamb. And that is why he said that he disagreed about sprinkling as well. Rabbah raised an objection to Ula's explanation of this disagreement between Eliezer and Akiva. And he bases Rabbah's objection to Ula is based on a different baraisa, which states, Rabbi Akiva responded and said, the sprinkling of purifying water on someone who is ritually impure due to contact with a corpse proves the matter when his seventh day of impurity occurs on Shabbos, and it is also Erev Pesach, right? So the final sprinkling for somebody who touched a corpse and wants to be purified, he gets sprinkled with this water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer on the third and seventh day after he touched the corpse, the third and seventh day of his impurity. And then he becomes, what's the word I'm looking for? Eligible. Then he becomes eligible to complete his purification. He still has to immerse in a mikveh and wait for nightfall. Okay. So Rabbi Akiva responded and said, the sprinkling of purifying water on someone who is ritually impure due to contact with a corpse proves the matter when his seventh day of impurity occurs on Shabbos, and it is also the afternoon before Passover. For it is done for the sake of the mitzvah in order to allow the person to eat the Paschal lamb, and yet it is prohibited only, and it is prohibited only due to a rabbinic decree. Sprinkling does not violate a biblical law, it violates a rabbinic decree, and nonetheless, it does not override Shabbos. From this baraisa, it is clear that Rabbi Akiva challenged Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the law of sprinkling that is performed in order to enable someone to eat the Paschal lamb. Rather, we must reject Ula's explanation and say instead that Rabbi Eliezer certainly taught Rabbi Akiva about sprinkling that is performed in order to enable someone to eat of the Paschal lamb. Right, so they were talking about that sprinkling, not the sprinkling of teruma. And with regard to the question that seeing that Rabbi Eliezer himself taught this halacha, what is the reason that Rabbi Eliezer then refutes it? And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Eliezer forgot his own teaching, and Rabbi Akiva came to remind him of his teaching. But rather than say, you taught us different the first time you taught us, rather than say that, Rabbi Akiva came to remind him of his teaching by drawing a kal vachomer inference that would cause Rabbi Eliezer to remember what he himself had taught. So Rabbi Eliezer wasn't being a smart aleck. He wasn't mocking his teacher. He was making a kal vachomer. If like this in the weaker case, then certainly like that in the stronger case is how a kal vachomer works. And the reason that Akiva spoke that way is he wanted to remind Eliezer of what he already knew and what he had taught earlier and what he must have forgotten. In other words, Akiva caught his teacher making an error, but didn't want to embarrass him and said, well, if you say like that, then it follows like this. And he thought that that would remind Eliezer of the teaching as it was supposed to have been understood. But Eliezer said, that's ridiculous, and took offense. And I think that what we can see happening there, I think this happens to all of us. When we realize we're being proved wrong, very often before that full realization is there, what we have instead is a strong instinct that, oh my gosh, I may have gone wrong, but no, I'm sure I'm right. It must be that this person who's challenging me is wrong and insulting, and I can just, instead of dealing with the error that I may have made, I'm just gonna, get mad at him and vent my anger at him. And that may have been the trap, the trap that Eliezer fell into. And the Gemara asks, if so, then let Rabbi Akiva say explicitly that this is what Rabbi Eliezer himself had taught him. But the Gemara answers, Akiva thought that it would be improper to tell his teacher that he had forgotten his teaching, and therefore his initial attempt was to remind him indirectly. The Gemara questions the reason for the law under discussion. Well, what is the reason that the sprinkling of purifying water does not override Shabbos? Since it involves the mere moving of the liquid from the utensil in his hand to the body of the person seeking purification, why should it be forbidden on Shabbos? Let it at least override Shabbos on account of the mitzvah fulfilling the obligation of bringing the Passover offering. Rabbah said, the prohibition against sprinkling is a rabbinic decree that was instituted lest one take the utensil containing the purifying water and carry it a distance of 4 cubits in the public domain, thus violating an actual Torah prohibition. And this is consistent with Rabbah's opinion in several other places in the Talmud that the sages forbade the fulfillment of certain mitzvahs due to a similar concern about carrying in the public domain. I'm almost done, so if you've got questions and comments, put them in there, and Nina will pass them to me via our trusty Google Doc. The Gemara asks, at least according to Rabbi Eliezer, let us carry the purifying water even in the public domain. For Rabbi Eliezer said, as a general rule, that actions that facilitate the performance of a mitzvah override Shabbos, even if they are not mitzvahs themselves and involve transgressions of Torah prohibitions. They say that there is room to distinguish between different situations. The rule that actions necessary to facilitate a mitzvah override Shabbos only applies when the person himself is fit to fulfill the mitzvah and the obligation to fulfill it is incumbent upon him. But here, where the person himself is not fit to eat the Paschal lamb as he is presently ritually impure, the obligation to fulfill the mitzvah is not incumbent upon him, and therefore actions that would enable him to fulfill the mitzvah do not override Shabbos. All right, so there, it was challenging. It's not easy to follow, but we worked our way through it. And so we saw this loving, it became contentious, but certainly in the end, it was a very, very loving dispute between Eliezer and Akiva, even though Eliezer, issued that little comment of, you're mocking me about slaughter. Perhaps you will end by slaughter. And that is what ended up happening by Akiva. But, that was many, 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 many years later. And much before that, like when Eliezer himself was excommunicated by the other sages who, maintained communication and contact with him and gave him the utmost love and respect, Akiva. Akiva never abandoned his teacher. Well, where does the law come out on this? Do we say like Eliezer that now that we're violating Shabbos anyway to perform the mitzvah that we're going to set aside the rabbinic decrees also? Or does it follow like Akiva that we only do that which is absolutely necessary? We get this in the last 3 paragraphs of the page that we're going to be talking about today, and I'll read them fairly quickly because this is much easier to follow. We learned in the Mishna that Rabbi Akiva stated a principle that any prohibited labor required for the offering of the sacrifice that can be performed before Shabbos does not override Shabbos. If there's something, like for example, sprinkling, so that you would be in a state of purity, right? If it falls on your 7th day and you can't sprinkle before that day, okay, then it's not possible for you. But if there's something you could have done, right? Like let's say you need a knife to slaughter the lamb and the knife isn't there. Do you carry that knife through the public domain? No, because you could have brought it before Shabbos. And that's the same law with the circumcision. Right? Eliezer would permit you to carry the knife through the public domain so that you could perform an 8th-day circumcision on Shabbos. But Akiva and the other sages do not. They say, no, we don't allow that because you could have brought it before Shabbos. Whereas slaughter, which cannot be performed on Erev Shabbos, overrides Shabbos. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva with regard to the Passover lamb. And the Gemara points out that we learned something similar to this in another Mishnah with regard to circumcision. Rabbi Akiva stated a principle. Any prohibited labor required for circumcision that can be performed before Shabbos, because it need not be specifically done on the day of the circumcision, does not override Shabbos. The circumcision itself, which if it's to be done on the 8th day, that's the mitzvah to do it on the 8th day, and if the 8th day of a baby's life falls on Shabbos, okay, so the circumcision must be performed that day, so it overrides Shabbos. But the other details of the procedure, which could have been done before Shabbos, must be done before Shabbos. And now that you have basically the same law for slaughtering a Paschal lamb, which falls on Shabbos, as for circumcision, which falls on Shabbos, why do we need to learn both laws? Couldn't we have learned one from the other? And here the Gemara will conclude by making that distinction that, circumcision is such a big, big mitzvah. There are 13 covenants associated with it, right? 13 times in the Torah, it's mentioned that I make my covenant with you, right? God said to Abraham, and it's that covenant of circumcision which we keep all through the ages, and it's mentioned over and over and over again how the circumcision sort of marks the Jews and distinguishes them from the other people, and that it is a sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. The same cannot be said about the Passover lamb. It's not mentioned 13 times as a covenant between God and the Jewish people. On the other hand, one who does not bring the Passover offering in its appointed time is punished with excision, but charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court. one who fails to perform the circumcision is not punished with kares. There's other punishments associated with it, but it's different because the baby obviously can't do anything for himself. It's incumbent on the father. But if for some reason the baby's not circumcised that day, the father is not punished with kares. So they have different stringencies associated with them, and therefore we needed to learn this concept of we only violate Shabbos for that which is absolutely necessary to do, for slaughtering the Paschal lamb or the circumcision, and we do not violate Shabbos for anything that could have been done before Shabbos. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check your comments and questions. Bill, Shabbat Shalom. As I've mentioned before, I really enjoy any story of Eliezer and Akiva. Looking forward to, most likely, cheering on Eliezer. So we can say that Bill is... All of the Shabbat Amidot reference to the sacrifices offered on Shabbos. I remember as a kid singing, Uve Yom HaShabbos. How is it possible that they couldn't slaughter? They could, right? So exactly what Sharon is pointing out is that on Shabbos, when we recite the Amidah, the standing prayer on Shabbos, there are references to the offerings of Shabbos, particularly in the Musaf Amidah and the additional offering, where it's like written out exactly this offering that's brought out, that's explained in that prayer that we say on Saturdays. So of course there's slaughter on Shabbos, and that's what we've talked about earlier in this chapter, that not only is there slaughter on Shabbos for the Paschal lamb when Passover begins Saturday night, but also every Shabbos for the additional offerings of Shabbos, right? But then what we could say is, if the knife was forgotten, are they going to carry the knife through the public domain to bring it? And that's where they might say, oh, well, that knife should have been there. They could have brought it before Shabbos, so maybe not. But we haven't discussed the case. Probably that would be the case, but we haven't specifically talked about the case of the Passover, the Saturday offering itself, the Shabbos offering, the Musaf, in this context. Yosef says, Rabbi Akiva was a convert during the Jewish-Roman wars, correct? No, he was not a convert. He's not a convert. He was a Jew, but he was a secular Jew, totally, uneducated in the ways of Torah, and with a chip on his shoulder against the sages. He said later when he became a sage that during my time of ignorance, I hated the sages, and I would have bit them like a donkey. And it was somewhere he says, not like a dog, because when a dog bites, it hurts you, but there's a limit. But when a donkey bites you, it's like a super painful bite. And he said, he just had a total hatred for the sages, maybe because he felt that they were holier than thou, or he just felt ignorant around them, or whatever it was. But he was not a convert, that to my knowledge. He just was a totally uneducated Jew who started learning when he was 40 at the instigation and request and with the support of his amazing wife, Rachel, who's really one of the heroines of Jewish history. And Tom says, please remind me, what is a kal v'chomer? So it's that kind of argument, right? So if this is a faulty kal v'chomer, if for the purposes of bringing the Passover offering, we violate the biblical law, which prohibits slaughtering on Shabbos, then how much more, in order to bring that offering, shouldn't we also violate rabbinic decrees, which are only, decrees of the sages and not written by God in the Torah? But it's a faulty kal v'chomer, because those rabbinic decrees don't have to be violated. If there was one that was essential to be violated, or we couldn't bring the offering at all, that would be something else. But the basic idea is, in a situation where there's a stringent law and we violate it, because of that situation, then a lenient law, wouldn't we violate it all the more? Or if we obey a lenient law in a difficult situation, how much more would we obey a stringent law? That's how a kal v'chomer inference works. usually translated to English with the Latin or Greek term, and a fortiori argument. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. We should all have such a sweet Shabbos. I'm pretty sure I mentioned at the beginning that the song that I played was beautiful, a Shiru Ladonai, Sing to God, from the Kabbalah Shabbos liturgy that we sang on Friday nights. That was Yehuda Solomon and the Moshav Band, an album that I guess should have been on my radar, but I just discovered it today. I'm so psyched. You can find it on Apple Music. It's called Moshav Shabbat Volume 1. And it's basically the Karl Bach melodies of the Kabbalah Shabbos service set to music in a really beautiful way by the Moshav Band. And Nina is reminding me to announce the Sunday event. I'm going nuts. What is the Sunday event? What is the Sunday event? I'm in front of the camera with the lights on, and I can't remember at this moment what the Sunday event is. What is the Sunday event? Help me, Nina. I'm seeing big type announced Sunday event. Oy. What is the Sunday event? I know there's an event on Sunday. Oh, thank you. Right, it's pinned to the top of our page. I'm going to be interviewed by Jessica Shaw of EW Live on SXM Radio as part of a talk, a Zoom talk sponsored by the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It's a wonderful museum in New York City. And they're doing a series of Zoom talks called the Legacies Series. And so I'm one of these events. So I'll be discussing the story of my mother and my grandmother, who are Holocaust survivors. Some of you have heard me tell that story before, others haven't. But it's going to be a far-ranging discussion on the legacy of the Holocaust. What does it mean? We're really approaching that time, tragically, when they're, the survivors, the people who actually lived through the Holocaust, are getting to be very old. And, at some point, there won't be any left. And so it's becoming so important for that next generation. So me, right? My mother is a Holocaust survivor. So my generation needs to know those stories and transmit those stories and make sure that the world knows what happened, and so never again. And then we're going to be discussing is how that Holocaust legacy informs, Judaism in the 21st century. What is, I teach the oral tradition, which is 3,000 years old. The Holocaust is, happened like yesterday compared to that. But how does it affect teaching? How does it affect observance? How does it affect festivals and holidays? How does it affect scholarship? We're going to be discussing all these topics, and we're going to talk about how my personal story, or my mother's and my grandmother's personal story, affected me and my life, and ultimately led, it's a direct link to become the accidental Talmudist and for this community to form around these teachings. So the link is right there. I think Nina put it in the comments, but you also find it pinned to the top of the Accidental Talmudist Facebook page. It's a Zoom event, so it's a free event, so just register to be part of the Zoom class. It's going to be a really great discussion. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And that is Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. But you can learn all the information at that link at the top of the Accidental Talmudist Facebook page, or I think the link is in the comments now. Thank you for reminding me, Nina. And everybody who's listening, you should all have a beautiful, 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 beautiful Shabbos. All the best.